Now let's go ahead and look at some of the issues that we want to pay attention to in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. You can see that that background is helpful because both of these letters are really aimed to encourage believers to remain faithful despite opposition and persecution. And this is all the more compelling if we think about these are brand new believers, really. These are believers who've only really been in the faith for a couple of weeks. I mean, when Paul leaves, so not when the letters come. There would have been more time than that. But they have Paul there for a relatively short period of time, and that church is planted, and then he has to leave. So all things considered, these are pretty young believers. One of the things that comes out of this is the faithfulness there is the realization that their persecution does not mean they are outside of God's will. And we could well imagine that somebody could come along and say, see, this really can't be a good thing if immediately, once you receive this gospel, people start giving you a bad time and you either lose your job or you're, being ridiculed for this faith, this belief. And I think a parallel exists when we think about the gospel going into different parts of the world, where immediately believers experience tremendous persecution the minute they put their faith in Christ. And this is a good letter to direct people to for that context. So in this, we get a reminder to consider the example of Jesus, that the one whom they are following experienced persecution. So clearly it's not out of God's will. I don't think this is what the Thessalonian correspondence is addressing, but this would be, I think, a valid application. And that would be somehow people talking about, if you follow Jesus, then you will prosper. Everything will work out fine. And then what happens, of course, is people put their faith in Jesus and difficult things happen. So it's really the encouragement to realize that when we put our faith in Jesus, sometimes life gets more complicated and more difficult. And it is not kind of this blanket promise that everything will just go perfectly. This also is, both of these letters address the issue about how to live in the light of Jesus' return. So the second point that I have there is godly living and instructions related to eschatology. Eschatology is the study of the end times. Okay, so when we think about eschatology, we're really talking about the end times at some level. For a lot of people, this is a really scary topic. Okay, they don't like any discussion about the end times, and for many people, it immediately brings up issues about, okay, if we turn on the news and there's another earthquake or there's something that happens, does this mean that we're in the end times? And I always love it because I spend a lot of time in Revelation, and so people frequently ask me that question. I love it because I always get to answer, yes, it does. And it has for the last 2,000 years. Because really we have to understand that the end times from a biblical perspective is that time after Jesus' ascension and before his return. So yes, we are living in the end times. I think it's a hard question to ask ourselves, are things increasing? Are we kind of experiencing more events? Because we live in a very globalized context right now where we're more aware of events that are going on, whereas peoples in other times in history would not have been as aware. So I'm going to be very quiet about that even when we get to Revelation, about whether we can map events and use them as some kind of indicator of the time that we're living in. Because I think overall we're living in a time period where really Jesus could return at any time. And I think we want to live with an expectation of immediacy, but we also want to live with a sense of preparation that we're also in it to win it. And we need to finish the race well, and we need to finish as strong as we began. So that's that tension that I talked about at the very beginning, that Thessalonians and other parts of the New Testament constantly are presenting a tension between, again, don't be caught off guard because Jesus can return at any second, but also don't slacken or lessen thinking, oh, it's going to be a long time, I can just not pay attention. So there's perseverance and expectation. I also want to say that the correlation here, the correspondence between godly living and the end times is very important. When we get to Revelation, one of the things that I'm going to stress that I think is often not stressed in Revelation is that the focus on eschatology, I actually think, has more to do with ethical living than it does with telling us when things are going to happen and how they're going to happen. We don't know what we're going to go through and what we're not going to go through. We can have an assurance that Jesus will be with us every step of the way. But I do think that if we understand that the world is under judgment, then that really is a challenge for us to live lives that are absolutely ethical, so that we ourselves are growing in holiness and we ourselves are being transformed in the image of Christ, but also so that the world around us has the opportunity to see that and to come into a saving relationship with Jesus. So in many respects, I think that's something that gets lost in the whole discussion about if eschatology is only focused on how do we map current events, the question of ethical living is often lost in that discussion. So I don't think that's any coincidence that Paul is trying to assure the Thessalonians of some things we'll talk more about. But at the same time, he's also saying what's key is godly living in light of that. And we might think about it this way, and I'll say this in several other contexts as well, but sometimes people accuse Christians of being so heavenly minded they're no earthly good. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but that's a criticism that is sometimes leveled against believers. And I think we should really think about it this way, that we are so heavenly minded that we are earthly good. In other words, when we're really, really focused on where we're headed and the fact that there really will be judgment, then that transforms the way we live day to day. And it's only when we separate those things as if there was no correlation between how we live today and the end times that I think we get into danger. So that's really one of the things I think is a tremendous contribution of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, is to focus on those. The next point that comes out of that is clearly the one that I have there is about believers being caught off guard because they are not thinking about spiritual things. They're not thinking about the reality that this is a world under judgment and that they need to be right with Jesus, to use that term. In a minute, I'll talk a little bit about the rapture because that's a question that comes up in 1 Thessalonians 4, but I'm not specifically talking about that right now. So the unbelievers being caught off guard is more of a general sense of living lives with no sense whatsoever that there's any accounting. Now, I would just kind of throw this out because I think that right now we're increasingly living in a time period where people live their life very much for the moment and very much not thinking that there are any consequences for actions. And there's any number of things we could look at, lifestyle behaviors, where I think that's evident. But I think there's a lot of things that are promoted in our culture right now where really there's a downplaying that there's any consequences for actions that really, when all is said and done, are very risky actions. We could think about drug use, we could think about binge drinking, we could think about some of the promiscuous lifestyles that are promoted, where often those are celebrated and even romanticized in movies, where the consequences of those actions are either put forward in a way that's funny, are meant to be funny, or are downplayed, diminished. And the reality is that we're living with a lot of people right now who are actually feeling extremely hopeless because they are in the midst of lifestyles where they are feeling the consequences, they are feeling the effects of those choices, and yet they're trying to reconcile that with a society that by and large says there aren't consequences for those kinds of actions. So I throw that out because I think that we really do live right now in a society, it's not unique to the United States, but in a society that is lulling people or kind of numbing people to the reality that there actually is judgment. And really, when all is said and done, from our perspective, we can look at God's judgment actually as an encouragement because it's the hope that evil does not prevail. It's the hope that evil is judged. But also we want to be looking at people who are caught up in lifestyles that are really hopeless in many respects, that we have the opportunity to offer out a word of hope. So I throw that out because when I'm talking about unbelievers being caught off guard by the Lord's return, I really think that characterizes an awful lot of the people that we're spending time with. which then heightens the need for believers to live with a sense of expectation and to live with godliness. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about here is something called the delay of the parousia. Parousia is a Greek word, so I like it, of course. It's a Greek word that could be just translated coming, and it's another way of talking about the Lord's second coming. So when we think about parousia, the word that you see up there, that's just another way of describing the Lord's return. And you might say, well, why don't you just call it the Lord's return? Because that's simpler. Well, I would, except for the fact that parousia is a word that you're often going to find in the literature. So it's a good word to know, because if you're reading through systematic theology or biblical studies, you're going to come across this word, and now you know what it means. So, but it is really talking about the Lord's return. And the so-called delay of the parousia is, I think, a problem that's been invented by and large. But it has to do with this idea that the early church assumed that Jesus was coming back right away. Right away. And so because of that, there was no thought about organizing anything for churches, so you wouldn't have church structure. There was no thought about things like church discipline, because he's coming back right away, so why do we need to kind of get organized? Then, as people suggest when they're talking about this problem of the delay of the parousia, when Jesus didn't come back after a year, after 5 years, after 10 years, after 25 years, then all of a sudden people began to realize, oh, maybe he's not coming back immediately. Maybe we need to think about organizing the church. Maybe we need to think about some of these issues. So that's, in some approaches to biblical studies, the delay of the parousia is an explanation and a way of dating some parts of the New Testament much, much later, well into the 2nd century. Now, I would say that this is overstated, and as I've said, if we look carefully, there's a tension that runs throughout all of the New Testament about the idea, as I said a minute ago, that Jesus could return at any time, or it could be a while, and we're to live in expectation of both. Ready for him to return at any second, but ready and willing to persevere for the long haul. So I think that this is overstated a lot of times. But people have said, they've looked at one part of 1 Thessalonians, it's verse 4:15, as I have on the outline there, where Paul says, those of us who are left behind will be caught up with those who have met the Lord. And we'll look at this passage in just a minute. But in that context, people have thought, well, see, this is evidence that Paul thought that he was going to be alive when Jesus returned. And then when that didn't happen, then the church had to, when Jesus kept delaying, so to speak, then the church had to get more organized. I'm not sure that's the best and only way to understand what Paul is saying in 1 Thessalonians 4:15, but I also think that Jesus' own teachings suggest that there will have to be a time of perseverance. So the idea that the parable of the 10 virgins is a good example. You have to prepare and wait for the bridegroom to come back, but he can return at any point in time. That's why you need to be ready. So there's a tension even in Jesus' own teaching. So again, I don't put a lot of stock in this kind of idea of a long delay that made the church rethink major issues. And as I put on the handout there, this is the kind of speculation that this is why the church became more institutionalized. I actually think that that institutionalization, so to speak, is not a helpful thing. I mean, it's good to have structure, and I don't mean this about any denominational structure at all. I think Scripture is pretty open to support a wide range of interpretations as far as denominations go. So I think it's wise to have elders or those who function like elders. It's wise to have those things in place. But I think anytime we get too caught up in kind of the programs and the structures and not have a sense that, Jesus could return at any point in time, then we're running a risk that kind of calcifies our hearts, and we need to be having an open heart that's ready and expecting that he can return at any point.